So yeah, I left to boarding school in the States when I was 14, and I was away from Egypt then for 4 years. Actually, I was in boarding school for 3 years, and then I left boarding school a year early. I was admitted to college by mistake a year early, and then started university in the U.S. Um, I was at Wesleyan University, but unfortunately, partly because I'd gone there too early, I really didn't know what I was doing. It was a very liberal arts college, and I had absolutely no idea what I was doing there. And as a result, I sort of flunked out of the university, um, and found myself kind of washed up with not much to do, um,
Did
and
that
had to
worry
make a
you? Did that
choice.
worry you, Max, or were you not very fussed about that, or how did that make, what did you feel about that, when the fact that you went too early and then you weren't able to manage, or you weren't able to cope?
Well, I mean, basically, I was pretty stupid. We were all pretty stupid at that age, I think. I was pretty silly. Um, I wasn't as fussed as one might have thought. I didn't think it was such a disaster. I just because I didn't actually know what I wanted to do next anyway, and I actually felt very nostalgic for Egypt. I wasn't, but I just wasn't sure what to do. I thought, shall I stay in America? And it's also one forgets, at the time, my parents were a little bit odd. They were odd people, and they were very hands-off parents, and in a way that even that at the time there was no internet, to have a telephone call with someone meant having to book a telephone call, go to a telephone office, long distance from Egypt. It was really quite complicated and difficult. And they were in Egypt, I was in America, but still they were terribly hands-off, and I was really left to my own devices. And I had just a little bit of money, and I was trying to decide what shall I do with myself. I was in New York City at the time. I had a girlfriend in New York City, and I tried to do anything I could to make some money. I was trying to decide what to do, and one day I actually went to Brooklyn Heights in New York, which overlooks the harbor. At the time, there were actually still functioning docks down below the promenade in Brooklyn Heights. I don't think they're functioning any longer. I think it's all parks and entertainment and stuff like that. But at the time, there were still docks. And I was, I was looking down towards the docks, and there was a ship down there onto which were being loaded, a kind of freighter, there onto which were being loaded by cranes these big red buses. And at the time, there was a program. This was shortly after Camp David, a few years later, and there was a lot of U.S. aid going to Egypt, billions of dollars of aid. And one of the things that was going to Egypt was these buses. They were terrible buses. They were awful buses. Um, and they were so bad and so noisy that they used to call them Sot America in Cairo, as this kind of like rattle of these really bad American-made buses. Um, but I was wondering, I couldn't see quite well enough from the distance that I was at, standing on the promenade, looking down. Are these red buses going to Egypt? And I could see that the name of the ship was written down uh, there on the back of the boat. And so I pulled my glasses out of the pocket of the jacket that I was wearing, the breast pocket, to kind of use my glasses as a kind of like magnifier, telescope thing. And indeed, the ship was going to Alexandria. It was an Egyptian ship going to Alexandria, and there were these buses going to Alexandria. The problem was that as I pulled my glasses out of the pocket, I'd forgotten that I had my little roll of like $100 bills in my pocket. And as I pulled the glasses out, my dollar bills got thrown up into the air, and it was a very windy day, and the wind just carried this money that I could watch. I could just see scudding over the highway and over the docks and down towards the water, like a half a kilometer away.
And that
And
was all the
so
money
there
you
went all my
had?
money.
Is that all the
Yeah,
money
that
you
was all the
had?
money I had.
Yeah.
That's all the money I had. All that I had otherwise was a TWA ticket to Cairo. So I had no choice. I
It
had to
was
go
destiny, Max. It was destiny
it
for
was
you to come
destiny.
back.
Yeah, it was destiny. Yeah. So I had to
So
go back to Cairo.
so that's a
And I
pretty
don't regret that.
yeah, that's a pretty big pivot, right, for you.
Yeah,
That
yeah. But
changed
it was
your trajectory completely.
yeah, it was the hand of God. But you see, I mentioned Tintin, I think, as one of my favorite books. But that scene with the money going across the docks, I mean, I don't think it's actually in a Tintin book, but it belongs in a Tintin book because it's sort of exactly the kind of
And that
scene that
would be on the double
went on.
page ending, right? It wouldn't be the first page. It
Exactly.
would be
There goes the
the
money.
big
Yeah,
cliffhanger. So was it when you were at AUC, were you also beginning to write for different publications, or did that come later?
Yeah, well, one of the privileges of not really having to take the university terribly seriously and being able to take, just one class per semester or two if I wanted, is that I had lots of time to do other things. And so, yeah, almost from the very first year as at AUC, I was also working at the same time. And I started working as a journalist almost immediately. I did other jobs too. I worked as a tour guide. I made maps at one stage, various other things. So I always had work and supported myself actually through university,
And
all those
what drew
university
you
years.
to journalism? What was it about journalism that you liked? Was it that you had a facility with language, or was there a curiosity about where you were living? What was it in particular that made you gravitate towards that?
Well, aside from reading Tintin and being, being a young reporter, it was a natural thing. I come from a quite literary family. I always read lots and lots and lots of books. I always found a facility with writing since I was a kid. All through all my years in school and high school, it was just the thing that I did was to write. Um, and Also, the thing about journalism is that it's a license to be curious. I've always been a very curious person, curious about other people, curious about other things, and I'm also curious in a slightly undisciplined way. Um, I'm not curious about one thing. I'm curious about a lot of things, um, and so journalism is a good excuse. You're allowed to be curious. In fact, that's what you get paid to be. Um,
So
and
you're a
so,
generalist in a way. You'd consider
yeah.
yourself a generalist.
Yes, yeah, yeah. I mean, I studied history and I'm interested in history, and I also think of myself as a sort of historian. That's what kind of journalists are. As they say, it's the first draft of history. Um, uh, and I'm interested in the first draft and the second draft and so on. But, I've always been curious about the world. Also, having grown up in Egypt during '67 war, I was in Egypt during the '73 war. Um, we listened to the BBC every day. I followed the news every day, even when I was a kid. Um, there were always dramatic events happening around us. It was quite a dramatic time. Shortly after I came back to Egypt from America, there was the assassination of Anwar Sadat, um, and events were very kind of they imposed themselves in a way on our lives and the way we thought at that time, perhaps more than now. And so I was very, very, always without thinking about it, this was what was likely to happen to me. So I started off as a journalist with local publications in Egypt, writing about things like business or stuff like that, publicity stuff, even
Hmm.
virtually advertising copy,
Yeah.
um, local magazines, features, stuff like that. And then eventually, after many years, I started doing more, kind of international journalism.
And then eventually you became the Economist correspondent covering Egypt and North Africa. Is that correct?
I started well. First, let's see. I mean, at first I was a what they call a stringer.
Yeah.
Not a paid staff person.
Hmm.
At the time, there was no staff correspondent for Egypt for The Economist, and so I became the person who covered The Economist for Egypt as a stringer. So I would be paid like a retainer, sort of monthly, something monthly, which helped to cover the rent, and then paid per article also. But at the time, I became a stringer for The Economist a long time ago. This was 1988, I think. And I also worked for other newspapers at the same time, um, and made quite a decent living actually as a stringer. But The Economist was one of my very first strings, yeah. And so yeah, I was working, and occasionally I did travel and reporting for The Economist. I was in Iraq a couple of times. I was in Algeria. I was in Palestine. For The Economist, even in those years. But I didn't actually get hired by The Economist as a proper staff person until 10 years later.
Hmm. So 1999 you became full time with them?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
And that and but your remit was Egypt and other places, or just Egypt?
when I was hired on staff, I'd been writing for The Economist for 10 years from the Middle East, from various places. And when I was brought on staff with The Economist in 1990, actually it was 2000, beginning of 2000. No, I was the Middle East bureau chief. So I
I
covered the
see.
whole of the Middle
I
East. I mean,
see.
it was not just Egypt.
Right,
Egypt was
right.
just a small part. I was based in Cairo,
Yeah,
but I actually covered 23 countries, I
yeah,
think,
yeah.
from Iran to Morocco,
Right.
basically.
Okay, got
And
it.
so
Yeah.
I traveled a lot, and I held that job for 15 years. And that was during also a very tumultuous period. And yeah, I traveled all over the region a lot. You know, I was on the road for a week or two out of every month for 15 years.
That takes its toll on someone after a while. I know we're going to get to that because I know that with the 2011 revolution, that was a pretty big pivot for you as well, pivoting out of the region. But before we go into that in more detail, I'd like just to pause and talk about your incredible book, which for me, I think I've read it maybe 3 or 4 times. It's really a very, very special history of Cairo. Very entertaining. It almost reads like fiction. I mean, it's fun, it's light, it's informative, and yet it's very scholarly. How did that come about for you? Was that just a natural progression for you, having lived here all your life? What made you begin that project?
Well, I think there were two different things. One is that I felt a kind of accumulated debt to Cairo. Um, during the 1980s, I had a really fun time. I mean, I was in and out of university, in and out of journalism. I was also did a lot of bad stuff. I smoked a lot of hashish. I spent a lot of time in Botneya, in the old city of Cairo. I went all over the country. I bounced around hitchhiking. I did, all the kind of things one does, and I really explored Cairo in a way that I think few other people have. I actually made with a friend of mine, William Lister, we did a series of maps of the old city in Cairo that actually involved walking down every single street in every alley of the old city. Um, and I felt like I actually knew Cairo extremely well. And then I'd studied the history. I mean, I did get a degree in Islamic history. Um, and so I was felt like I owed something to deliver to return this knowledge of Cairo, and also, also a sense of a fondness for Cairo. So that was one thing. But then, as often in life, there was also a kind of fate element to this, because in fact, at the time that I wrote the book, I had moved to London with my wife, who's a doctor. She got a scholarship to do a master's degree in London, and we moved to London for a year. And in London, I wasn't allowed to, I didn't, at the time, I've now got a British passport. At the time, I did not have one. I had just an American passport. I wasn't allowed to really work formally. And so I was looking for things to do. And I had an inspiration to just write this proposal for a book on Cairo. And it was just an inspired proposal. It just sounded great. And so I sent it off to a bunch of, I got an agent, and the agent sent it to publishers. And I was surprised to find that there was actually a bidding war between publishers. And I got a very nice advance to write the book. So that gave me, when we returned to Cairo, where I didn't have a job to go back to, really. I was just a stringer as a journalist. It gave me something to do. So it was kind of out of unemployment and desperation that I, thought of doing a book on Cairo.
But it
So
turned out to be very serendipitous in the end for you, didn't it? It was a very
yes,
sort
very
of,
much so. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, absolutely. No, and it was actually very good, because we subsequently we moved again, and we lived in Tunisia for a year. And there also, I was very underemployed as a journalist. Not much happens in Tunisia, particularly then. It was under the sort of dictatorship of Ben Ali, and as a journalist, there was very little that one either could write about, or was allowed to write about. In fact, so to have this book contract, I wrote most of the book on Cairo actually in Tunisia,
Hmm.
not when I was there. It was also good to have distance from the subject, because as any nonfiction writer knows, the most tempting thing is to just keep stuffing your book with more stuff. um, and finding more sources. It's the greatest way to procrastinate. So when you're actually, 1,000 miles away from your subject and with no access to a proper library or anything like that, then you just have to sit down and write the thing. So that was actually kind of useful. So it took a year to write the book, and a lot of that was done in Tunisia.
And this is, I'm guessing this is pre, being able to, just do a Google search on whatever you needed. This is, you were using firsthand materials, you were going into the rare books library downtown. I mean, that was your research base, I'm assuming.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, there was no Google then. There were there were search engines. I think had just appeared, but just to get on the internet, you had to this. It was a had this sort of weird squealing sound, and
Yeah,
you'd do it through the phone line,
the
and
dial-in,
it
yeah.
was yeah. I mean, it was quite. It was about as much as as could be handled was just to send an email.
Yeah.
But to upload and download, and certainly not the kind of resources that you'd need to write a historical book, were absolutely not there. Yeah, yeah. No, so
And
as you say, I
yeah,
did the actual kind of historical research before going to Tunisia. I'd done it in Cairo. I'd
yeah.
spent a previous year largely in the rare books library. Yeah.
And tell me what your reaction was when the book was published. Did you anticipate the reception it got, or did it completely take you by surprise?
It took me by surprise. Um, I thought it was a good book. I thought it was good, but it got wonderful reviews. I have to say, but it's kind of funny how these things work because it sort of comes in a snowball. I think I was very lucky to get one good review. The first one that came out was in the Financial Times. Somebody who just particularly liked the book, and because it got a really good review in the weekend Financial Times, suddenly other journalists picked it up and it got reviewed more widely. It wasn't promoted very well by the publisher, by the way. It just got picked up because of the reviews, and it got excellent reviews everywhere. So no, I was very chuffed by that. And these things are sort of serendipitous. I mean, I was lucky to fill a gap that people wanted at the time. Sometimes authors have bad luck in crazy ways. I mean, it's something that seems to happen quite often is that two or three books about the same subject all come out at once, and so none of them get the attention that they might merit. But I was lucky with that book, and it did pretty well. Yeah.